Okay, everyone, thank you for joining us. My name's Christian Dirk, and I'm a researcher at Oak Network. I'm here with Bill Laboon from the Web3 Foundation. Today we're going to be talking a little about governance and some of the topics related to on-chain governance. Bill, would you like to introduce yourself and maybe say a little bit about what you do at the Web3 Foundation?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Bill Laboon. I'm the head of education and grants at Web3 Foundation. I've been here and working on Polkadot for the last, I guess, a little over 3.5 years now, and involved in the blockchain space quite a bit before that, actually. In my previous role, I was a lecturer at the University of Pittsburgh, but I really just couldn't stay away from the blockchain industry and had to jump in. So that's me in a nutshell.
That's great. I think you have some really unique experience that I'm really interested in talking to you a little bit today about Polkadot governance and a lot of the on-chain concepts. But I think the first place that I really want to start is definitely learning a little bit about the philosophy behind the Polkadot governance and a lot of the Parachain governance mechanisms. So do you think you could give us a bit of insight into some of the key historical influences on the governance system, or things that you find interesting from the past, from like a political or philosophical landscape?
Sure. So the end goal, I think, of Polkadot is to be as decentralized as possible. But also, I think we realized very early on that this sounds really great in theory, right? Everyone wants to be decentralized, but there are a lot of problems with that. And I think actually historically, there have, again, we can look back through political systems in general and see a lot of issues of this, right? And this tension, I guess you could say, between centralization and decentralization, because there are benefits to both, right? Now, obviously, being in blockchain, I'm a big proponent, just to express my bias towards decentralization of politics in general. But we saw, so again, you asked historically, right? We look at like ancient Greece with the direct democracy, like Athens, for instance. Actually, like Athens versus Sparta is probably a very good analogy here, right? Where Athens, a lot of creativity, a lot of stuff happened. Under the sort of the classical classical direct democracy period, but it was very difficult to get things done. There was a lot of dissent and division, right? We saw whenever there was a war, people would argue, should we get into it, should we not? Now compare that to something like Sparta, which is again sort of classical Sparta. Think almost like the Soviet Union in World War II, right? If they had a goal, they would go for it, right? There was a lot of power that could be set behind that goal. There was not a lot of dissent, or if it was well hidden, which also there was a lot of benefits to that, right? You could get things done, but were you always sure that was the right thing to do? And again, I don't know if I wasn't around for the original decisions of for governance in Polkadot. I sort of joined like right after those decisions were made. But so I don't know if that was specifically their idea, but I think that was definitely something that Gav knows and then the people know about. All right, so that I think people saw like we want decentralization, but we also saw problems with decentralization in terms of getting things done. And so a historical reference that I do know was used. There's a famous essay, Exit, Voice, or Loyalty, right? So you as a member, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the author right now, but if you just Google Exit, Voice, Loyalty, you'll find it. So the thing is, for any individual in a political system, right, you've got a couple of choices, right? You can be loyal to that system, which is the easiest thing, right? My country, right or wrong. You've got a voice, like you can vote, try to make your voice heard, say, hey, this is something I think we should do, or you can just leave. And I think early blockchain philosophy was you always have the option to leave, right? You always have the option to fork. Okay? And so we saw this, right, with Bitcoin. Most famously Bitcoin Cash, but there's a million other Bitcoin forks out there. Like, I don't like this about Bitcoin, right? I don't like the block size limit, right? Famously. But there are other things, like I don't like proof of work. There is a proof of stake Bitcoin, right? I don't like ASICs. So there was Bitcoin Gold. Okay? But it turns out, right, when you fork it, actually, there's a lot of problems to this. And we wanted to avoid that in Polkadot. So we wanted to have a place where people could really feel like their voice matters. And that's where governance comes in. So what we have actually is that governance V1, as we now call it, allows the majority of stake to always command the network. We want to be decentralized in that way. But we try to limit some of the problems by having an elected Polkadot council, so basically indirect democracy, and also the technical committee, which adds some of the benefits of technocracy, right? Of allowing the people that understand the technology to make decisions. However, we also tried to really limit their power. So council has very specific, very prescribed powers, and the technical committee, really the only thing they can do is adjust the speed of referenda. Say, hey, this is an emergency referenda, we should get it done quickly. So what we tried to do, philosophically, was have the benefits of decentralization with some of the benefits of centralization. And as we've gone on, we've seen that it generally works pretty well, but we would like to continue on the path towards decentralization using the lessons learned from this governance V1. So I apologize, that was a long intro, but hopefully it gives a good overview.
No, I think it's perfect. I think you mentioned some of the topics that I've explored a few times, and I think one of the great ones is the idea of tension, especially decentralized tension, because in many ways the governance system is the least decentralized aspect of the blockchain, but in many ways it becomes the most innovative section because it really has that ability to help evolve the entire network. So in many ways those two things are at an end. But you mentioned Governance 2.0. Can you maybe tell a little bit about Governance 2.0 for some of the core changes for people at home who might not be sure about them?
Sure. So the idea of Governance V2 is to move more towards a totally decentralized network. So governance in Polkadot is extremely powerful, right? Compared to really any other chain out there, because it can actually change the rules of the system. So think about it as again, apologies. You can probably tell from my accent, I am American, so I'm familiar with the American political system. But we can essentially change the Constitution, right? The founding documents as part of governance, right? Which and of course, there are a lot of hurdles in the way, but if 50% plus one of the community decides that whatever Polkadot should have some major change, then that can happen, right? However, that's also very dangerous. So we have the council right now. So we have people that are elected to essentially act as your representatives. So I'm on the Kusama Council, but I'm elected, right? But by people, there's nothing about my role at Web3 that got that to me. It's, there's 100 and some people that have put up KSM to have me in that. Oh, thank you. Thank you for your vote. And we have the technical committee, right? That can make some decisions. But this is very centralized, right? There are 19 Kusama council members. That's very small. We want to spread that while keeping the ability, right, for people to to ensure that the network operates properly. So very, very high level, what Governance V2 is going to change, it's essentially going to get rid of the technical committee and council, right? So everything will be done by referendum, right? Which is, in some senses, right, we're decentralizing there, okay? We are also going to still have something that is similar to the technical committee called the fellowship. So the fellowship, again, is going to have very, very limited powers, okay? But mostly involved with saying, hey, this is an emergency, we need to do things very quickly. But it's going to be, anyone essentially can get voted into it if they have done work on the core Polkadot protocol. Right. So what we want is, this technical, we want technical people to say yeah, we've examined this and we trust it. So with this decentralization is also going to come the ability to make a lot more referenda, right? To change things much more often. But right now that's, essentially limited to one referendum per voting period. So especially on Polkadot, this is very slow. With Governance V2, we're saying, hey, there's a lot of differences, right? From changing all of the code, which would be very, very dangerous, all the way to providing a 2-dot tip to someone, which is not very dangerous. So what we have is, we have these referenda on different tracks, and you can actually have multiple referenda per track, right? So we're, scaling this out a little bit, these governance decisions, and making it so that anyone can propose a referendum, and then essentially, and we can get into the details of how this works, but everyone votes on it, and depending on how much DOT or KSM votes for something and what percentage of it, that can pass in a shorter or longer period of time. So again, there's a very fixed limit on Polkadot and KSM with governance v1. Everything takes 28 days, to make a decision, and then 28 days to execute. But we see very small. Let's say that someone is asking for a treasury proposal, a relatively small treasury proposal, like a few hundred DOT or something. Should we really be holding up everything else just for that? And if after 7 days of voting, 100%, we have unanimous consent, a huge number of people have voted on it, a large number of DOT. Do we really need to keep holding up this, right, for that? So we actually can have things in governance v2 with variable amounts of length of time before things get enacted. So essentially everything becomes a referendum. We can have more referenda. The technical committee becomes this much larger, like perhaps thousands of members of fellowship, and we get rid of the council. So we can dig into any one of those things. They're all, like everything in life, like a little more complicated than that high-level overview.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I kind of want to approach it a little bit from a Parachain perspective at the moment, because obviously as part of my role, I've helped set up a lot of the governance system for our Parachain Oak network and for our Canary Touring network. And a lot of the changes to governance 2.0 seem really useful, like especially the origin types. So it makes things much easier. But we currently have a very little turnout on a lot of our proposals. There's not much of a queue going on. So will Parachains have the option to kind of stay on governance 1 or go to governance 2, or can they kind of utilize both systems where they have the origin types and they can kind of keep their committees and councils? Because the early stages of a lot of the Parachains are really utilizing a lot of those councils. I know like Moonbeam, for example, has a committee purely just for treasury councils, and Akala has a separate council as well. So will Parachains kind of get to pick and choose the best things from these, or is the eventual goal for everyone to kind of switch to this governance 2.0 to really ensure that high level of decentralization?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So first off, you can run both governance v1 and v2 simultaneously. Yep. So that's certain, and that in fact is the plan for Kusama. When this governance v2 goes out, we're actually still going to have governance v1 operating in tandem. And parachains, as long as they align with the consensus, right? So really at like an architectural level, not a governance level, they can do whatever they want, right? So you can have a parachain using governance v1, right? Continuing to use those palettes or making adjustments to them. You can use governance v2. You could just have like one person with sudo access, right? To your parachain if that's what you want. The governance of the parachains is really not limited by the relay chain. The only thing the relay chain says is whatever you do, you need to essentially tell me at first, right? When you first register as a parachain and you bring in the WASM blob explaining your rules, as long as those rules, as long as you continue to follow those rules in your blockchain and the collators keep sending proofs of validity that you are following this, then the parachains can have whatever sort of governance they want. I know some parachains have been they're also interested in governance v2. I know that some do not really see that. Some I don't know what they're doing, but really it's up to the parachain. So again, sort of like going. I live in Switzerland right now, and we actually have a very similar system where every canton has its own rules, right? So Zug, for instance, where my canton, there's no minimum wage. In in another canton where Geneva, the minimum wage is like 25 francs per hour. Like it's huge, right? But it's fine, right? We all have different rules. Like the governance is different. Like here in Canton Zug, like we have a mayor and a canton committee. In Engelberg, I know they have they don't have a mayor, they have a valley master, like, right? So everyone has different political systems, right? But it's fine. They all agree on certain things. They all agree that, in terms of like, military, and that they're all, under like the federal council. But I see Polkadot actually is very similar to that, where as long as you agree, right, hey, here are the rules that I'm going to do, all the Polkadot relay chain is interested is that you follow those rules that you set up. But how you want to run your own affairs in the Parachain, that's up to the Parachain.
Yeah, I find that very interesting because I've heard the analogy before that some people consider the parachain governance kind of like jurisdictions within a state, and that kind of fits with like what you're saying. But I think it creates a lot of opportunities to have a real difference in how governance is set up on each parachain. But do you think we may get some difficulties with how we can really evaluate different parachain governance to understand like the quality of different projects on Polkadot?
I mean, yes, in the sense that it's very difficult to compare, right? There's one of the nice things about Substrate. So, just if anyone's not familiar, that's the framework that's used to build parachains. I think all parachains right now, but theoretically, you don't need to use it. But one of the great things about it is how flexible it is, right? And so it's not like you can just, there's just one knob we change, and then we see how that parachain does versus another, right? So like a DeFi focused parachain also is going to have very different metrics for success than something like a social media parachain or insurance parachain, supply, right? So they're going to have different needs for governance. They're going to have different setups. So I think there are so many variables. It's going to be difficult to say, well, this governance is better than this. But what I do think we're going to see is if there are problems with particular types of governance. So that doesn't mean we can say, oh, well, this one is 6 times better than this. But what we can see is a little more qualitative, right? So there was a recent hack, essentially, where someone was able to control a majority of the council on one of the parachains and then send the tokens out and exchange them very, very quickly. Well, all right, now in retrospect, we can see, all right, there is a specific problem here, right? Now, I'm not saying like that governance is better or worse, but in these particular circumstances, there was a problem. And so now, not only they, but everyone else can see, well, maybe I should add a time delay to council decisions, or provide like other limitations. Like it's very similar, right, to this. I think like the way that security has happened in general in the software world, where in the old days you really wanted to make sure that everything was entirely secure before you sent it out, and then you just wouldn't tell anyone about it, right? Security through obscurity. Here, everyone can look at what's happening in governance, all of these chains. They can try governance on all these different chains, see what works, find out problems, and grow from that. And I think we really are in the early days of governance in not just in Polkadot, in blockchain, and I would say just in the world, right? With the ability to communicate so easily, right? I think this is going to have like major changes to just how governance works, and so I think that we're now seeing this like these laboratories of democracy, right? Of how governance can work in different parachains.
Yeah, I think it's great that you brought up that situation, because I'd spoken quite a few times about the possibilities of governance council attacks. I'm personally a governance council member on 3 or 4 parachains at the moment, and runners up on another 3 or 4 as well. And so it's something really interesting. But as I've said before, I think that the ability to do those types of attacks and cause those types of problems is actually the governance system working correctly. It requires that level of decentralization. If that's the ideology that we want to follow, there has to be that potential for bad users, because we don't want to be like the ones making the decision about what can and can't be done. So I think it's really interesting that the parachains are already starting to experience this, and the idea is that hopefully we'll all get to grow from that experience and get much better. So I think it's it's great. It's a good time to be a governance nerd. So I'm really appreciating it. But I also wanted to ask you a little bit about working in governance, because obviously the governance system is extremely complex, and it draws upon themes from so many different types of areas. Like it's highly technical in some ways, and then it's philosophical in others, and then it's political in others, and it's also like quite social. So I would say that, well, maybe from your opinion, I'll ask you, but do you think it requires like a huge diversity of different experiences to really make sure that we have all these types of people working in the governance system on chain?
Yes. I think, as you mentioned, for any individual person working on governance, it requires a lot of different skills, right, from different backgrounds. If you are, 100% technical, you don't have many, social skills or, understand politics, it's going to be very difficult to get things done in governance. And conversely, if you only have, political skills, but you look at it in extrinsic and you're like, I don't know what this does, then you're also not going to get anything done. But that said, I do think it requires, just like real governance, right? You want this diversity of outlook. So again, speaking of the American political system, I don't know others nearly as well. There's a huge, if not majority, then definitely plurality of lawyers in the American political system. And I think, again, not trying to get too political, like in the here in terms of like good or bad, I think you can see the influence of that, right? I think there's this stereotype, right, of American culture is very legalistic, right, and like people can get sued for any reason, right? And I think that's because you have a lot of lawyers, right? So you have a very lawyers think of things in a lawyerly way, and similarly, I think in governance systems, you have a bunch of programmers, you have a bunch of tech nerds, and they think of things in a very programmer tech nerdy way. And I think, that's also very visible, right? And again, not just in Polkadot, although definitely in Polkadot, but in other governance systems, blockchain governance systems. And so I think, trying to get more people involved in governance, bringing them in, having, end users and training them. I think training is the wrong word, but having them understand governance and get interested in governance, is something that's very important that we need to do. With governance v2, in Polkadot, in some ways it's more complicated, but in other ways it's easier because you can delegate your vote on certain topics to others, right? So you can say, well, I want to start, looking at whatever tips or spending proposals, but I really don't understand the code well enough, so I'm going to let someone else handle that, right? I don't have to vote on that, but I can say I trust this person. And I think having courses, having things like this, right? Talks where we discuss governance, where we get people interested in it that aren't tech nerds and aren't governance nerds, can really expose some flaws and really let people look at these issues with different eyes. And I think that's going to be very valuable going forward.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Like I've had to start really studying a lot of like ancient Greek principles to get understanding of like a lot of the concepts that are around right now. And I think that as we get a higher diversity of people working in the ecosystem, it'll really strengthen the governance system. So I'm really looking forward to it. Plus it means we get to have more fun political kind of discussions. So I think we're really good. I've got a couple community questions from people that have submitted to us. So I might jump into those because I know we don't have too much time. But the first one's a little bit about Oak Network, so I had to do that one. But the question is, how do you see Web3 being able to use our tech, referring to Oak technology, to Oak Network, to operate automation within government bodies? Do you think do you think there's a chance for some automation parachain to be working on the governance systems?
So I'm not sure what you mean by that. But like to have like automatic votes?
It's more that so like we can potentially people can schedule like future transactions. Like so, for example, one case that we've thought about is that after you delegate or after you make a vote, so you can automatically claim your tokens back. But essentially, our blockchain enables any type of future transaction to happen. So you could essentially delegate if this happens or if something else occurs, do this task. So yeah, it's I think I haven't really been able to think of any great use cases for the governance, but I'm hoping that in the future we'll be able to use some automation to make it even better.
No, I mean I can actually just off the top of my head think of a few use cases for that. You may be a person who is really interested, again, just like let's keep going with like tips, right, and treasury proposals, and you may be a person who is like sort of a if I can be a stereotypical Bitcoin maxi, right? Just hodl, right? Our treasury should just, we should never spend anything. Then you could say, well, I just want to automatically vote no, Any proposal that comes in, just vote no against it. And then if I see something I like, maybe I can go back and change it, right? Or vice versa. You could say, you know what, we need to grow, we need to spend on the treasury. Anytime a vote comes up, I want to, for a treasury spending proposal, I want to vote for it. And then I can go back and vote, right? And maybe change no if someone's saying, give me money for gummy bears or something. So I mean, that's just one example, right? Or you could, you don't, maybe this is not an ideal scenario, but I disagree with everything this person proposes, right? Or this account proposes. Anytime that person proposes something, and again, coming from America, right? I know a lot of my friends on one side of the political aisle or the other. They say whatever this other person proposes, I want to vote against. Again, so I don't know how good that would be for governance, but it's certainly a use case, right? That allows people to express their opinions, in an automated way. So I think that's something interesting.
I think it's interesting as well that you mentioned that, because a topic that I've discussed with other people before is that as the governance system grows, and especially with governance 2.0 and more parachains, the amount of referenda that are coming through are going to be higher and higher. So the difficulty in actually creating your understanding of everything that's going on is going to get harder and harder, especially if we try to reach that kind of scalable level that everyone really wants Polkadot to reach. So potentially using some form of automation to make sure that everything is going the right way, we could see in the future. So I'm really excited about that for sure. I have one more question for you before you have to go. But at Polkadot Decoded 2022, Gavin Wood spoke about the Governance 2.0 changes. And in the talk, he mentioned the fellowship, and he likened it to a martial arts organization with kind of like belts. Do you know if that's an actual inspiration for him, or is it just a simple analogy he's kind of using to describe it?
I'm honestly, I'm not sure if that was the inspiration, but based on his level of knowledge and the closeness of the analogy, I'm pretty sure it is. I don't want to state that definitively, but I really do think it was an inspiration, and if not, it definitely is a very good analogy. I'm not involved in martial arts, but as a kid, I was in Taekwondo for a while, and it just reminds me. I think it's such a perfect analogy. It does work well for it.
Yeah, I like it too. I'm a fan of MMA, so it really resonated with me when he explained it like that. Well, that's pretty much all I have planned. Thank you so much for spending time with us. I found it very informative, and hopefully a lot of other people did, so that my boss will let me do more governance chats to people within the ecosystem. But it's been really good, and I really appreciate your time. I know that you're speaking later today in the Kusamaverse. Is there anything else you want to let people know in case they're watching and they can keep tabs on you?
Yeah, sure. So yes, I'll be having another AMA, my first Metaverse AMA later with Momentum in the Kusamaverse. Probably the best way to see what's happening, with me and with Polkadot is following my Twitter account at Bill Laboon.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for listening. I'll hopefully have another talk planned soon. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you.